Millionaire receives a hug by mistake from a poor girl and discovers true love. The airport was alive with a humming energy, announcements echoing from the intercom. The scent of roasted coffee wafting from nearby kiosks. And hurried travelers dragging their luggage across the polished floors. Among the bustling crowd stood Sophie Taylor, her heart pounding in anticipation. Today wasn't just any day, it was the day her older brother, Adam, was finally coming home. Months had passed since she'd last seen him, and she had spent every second of that time missing him. She stood on her tiptoes, eyes darting over heads and shoulders, scanning the arrivals gate. Then, there, a tall figure, broad shoulders, dark tousled hair, the confident stride, it had to be Adam. Without hesitation, Sophie darted forward, weaving through the throng of people, her heart swelling with relief and excitement. "Oh my God, Adam," she squealed, throwing herself at him, arms wrapping around his torso like a lifeline. His body stiffened at the sudden contact. But she didn't notice. The moment her arms encircled him, Sophie let out a shaky breath. Finally, months of waiting, of loneliness, of missed calls and texts that couldn't make up for his absence, it all melted away. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling the scent she thought she'd find familiar. But then, something felt wrong. His chest was firm, too firm. Adam wasn't a gym addict. And the scent, it was sophisticated. A rich, woody cologne, far too luxurious for Adam's usual soap and water routine. Sophie's stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. Slowly, dread creeping up her spine. She pulled back, tilting her head up to look at her brother's face, except, it wasn't Adam. Her breath caught. The man staring down at her was a complete stranger. And not just any stranger. He was unfairly, devastatingly handsome. Tall, chiseled jawline, stormy gray eyes that could cut through steel, and a perfectly tailored navy blue suit that screamed money and power. His expression was unreadable, an eyebrows slightly raised, lips slightly parted in mild amusement, as if she were the most unexpected part of his otherwise planned-out day. The silence between them stretched for exactly half a second before Sophie's brain caught up to the reality of what had just happened. Her breath hitched, her entire body tensed in horror. "Oh my God," she blurted, stumbling back so fast she almost tripped over her own feet. Her arms flailed as she tried to process what she'd just done. I got the wrong hug. I hugged the wrong person." A slow, deep chuckle rumbled from the man's chest. That was unexpected. His voice was smooth, like velvet draped over steel. Sophie's face burned hotter than a sun flare. "I thought you were my brother," she explained frantically, waving her hands in wild gestures. "He's tall, he has dark hair, and from a distance, and with my emotional nearsightedness." "Emotional nearsightedness," he echoed, lips twitching. "Yes, when emotions take over, and your brain stops working properly. Like, you see what you want to see instead of what's actually in front of you." The corner of his mouth twitched again. "I see. So, you were so emotional you mistook a billionaire for your brother?" Sophie blinked. "Wait, what?" The amusement in his gray eyes deepened, as if he were fully aware of the growing realization dawning on her. A giant, muscle-bound security guard in a black suit suddenly stepped forward, positioning himself beside the man like a shadow. "Mr. Carter," the bodyguard said in a gruff voice, eyes locking onto Sophie like she was a security threat. Sophie froze. "Carter. Brian Carter. Brian Carter. The billionaire tycoon. A financial powerhouse who owned half the city. And a man so elusive that even the media rarely caught more than a glimpse of him. The kind of man who had entire airports cleared for his arrivals if he wanted." And she had just thrown herself at him like an overexcited golden retriever. "Oh, my God," she whispered, pressing her fingers against her burning face. His smirk widened. "Ah," he mused, tilting his head, "you just realized who I am, didn't you?" Sophie wanted to crawl into a hole and never come out. "This is bad," she muttered under her breath. "This is so bad." "Why?" he asked, clearly entertained. "Because," she waved toward the airport's security cameras, her voice turning slightly hysterical. "This was probably caught on every single security feed. And now I'm going to be all over the internet as the random girl who assaulted Brian Carter with an unsolicited hug. And then people will start digging into my life. And they'll find my embarrassing middle school talent show video. And Brian actually laughed. A deep, rich, genuine laugh. Sophie's stomach flip-flopped. I wouldn't call it assault, he said, eyes gleaming with amusement. You seemed pretty comfortable. I was comfortable, because I thought you were my brother. She protested, flailing again. And now that you know I'm not? Sophie threw up her hands. Now I want to relocate to a remote mountain and live in exile for the rest of my life. Brian let out another chuckle, crossing his arms. You're afraid of billionaires? I'm afraid of accidental life-altering humiliations, she corrected. Understandable. Sophie exhaled sharply, gathering the last shred of her dignity. Okay, look, this never happened. You go your way, I go mine. We erase this from our memories. Deal? Brian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, his gaze sweeping over her as if she were a puzzle he wasn't quite done solving. Then, a slow, knowing smirk curved his lips. You think I'll just forget? He asked, tilting his head. Sophie swallowed hard. Why did that sound dangerous? You will, she insisted. Brian chuckled. And then, with the kind of confidence only a billionaire could possess, he said, we'll see about that. And just like that, he turned, adjusting his expensive suit, and walked away. Sophie watched in horror, heart still pounding, knees weak, face still burning. She knew one thing for certain. This was not the last time she would see Brian Carter. And she was in serious trouble. Do you think Brian will let this go? Or is Sophie now stuck in his world forever? Comment below and let us know your thoughts. Subscribe for more amazing love stories. Sophie Taylor couldn't shake off the embarrassment that had cemented itself into her bones. Ever since that disastrous mistaken hug at the airport, she'd been replaying the scene in her head, her arms wrapped around a total stranger. Her face pressed against his chest, his deep, amused chuckle ringing in her ears. And not just any stranger, Brian Carter. The billionaire. A man so elusive, he practically lived in shadows, avoiding the public eye like it was a plague. Yet here she was, the only woman in the world who had thrown herself at him without a second thought. She had wanted to disappear that day, to sink into the earth and never be seen again. But as fate would have it, life wasn't done playing cruel jokes on her, because Brian Carter wasn't done with her. Sophie worked at Grounded Brews, a small cafe tucked inside the bustling airport. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it paid the bills for her and her younger brother, Oliver. Their parents had passed away years ago, and since then, Sophie had done everything she could to keep a roof over their heads. Life had never been easy, but she had always fought through it. She thought the Brian Carter incident was behind her, a ridiculous fluke of fate. But then, he came back. It happened 2 days later. Sophie was in the middle of an afternoon rush, whipping up cappuccinos and dodging impatient customers when a hush fell over the cafe. It was subtle at first, like a shifting breeze, but soon, the usual clatter of plates and hurried conversations morphed into whispers and stolen glances. She didn't have to turn around to know. He was here. She felt the weight of his presence before she even saw him. Slowly, reluctantly, Sophie looked up, and there he was. Brian Carter. Tall, imposing, absurdly handsome in another perfectly tailored suit. His stormy gray eyes locked onto her with a hint of amusement and something else. Something unreadable. Sophie's stomach tightened. What was he doing here? She braced herself, heart slamming against her ribs as he walked up to the counter. Miss Taylor, he greeted smoothly. Her fingers tightened around the espresso machine lever. He knew her name? Oh God, you again, she muttered, forcing a smile that was about 2% genuine and 98% panic. You sound surprised, Brian mused. I told you we'd see each other again. She cleared her throat. Right, and what can I get for you? Mr. Carter? Or do billionaires not drink commoner coffee? Brian smirked, as if entertained by her resistance. I'll have a coffee. Black. And, he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I want you to make it. Sophie narrowed her eyes. Oh, he was messing with her. Afraid my employees can't meet your high-class billionaire standards? She shot back. Not at all, he replied easily. I just like to see talent in action. Talent? She was making coffee, not painting the Sistine Chapel. Still, she turned and made his coffee, hyper-aware of his gaze following her every move. She worked quickly, precisely, keeping her head down. Finally, she set the cup in front of him. There, One commoner's coffee, made by hand. Enjoy. Brian picked up the cup, took a slow sip, and then, a small smile appeared on his lips. Impressive, he murmured. You have skills, Miss Taylor. Sophie crossed her arms. I pour water over beans. It's hardly a superpower. Brian's smirk widened. You're not easy to impress. Are you? Not particularly. I like that. Sophie blinked. What? Before she could unpack that statement, Brian glanced at his watch. Enjoy your shift, he said, standing up. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again. And then, he left. Just like that. Sophie stood there, completely dumbfounded, as her coworkers gawked at her like she had just been knighted by the Queen of England. Did Brian Carter just flirt with you? Her colleague, Jasmine, whispered. Sophie scoffed. No, he's being weird. But deep down, she knew, he was intrigued, and that terrified her, because she had no idea why. A deal that changes everything. Over the next few days, Brian Carter became a regular at the cafe. Every morning, like clockwork, he showed up at the counter and asked for Sophie to make his coffee. It wasn't normal. Billionaires didn't just loiter at airports drinking overpriced lattes. But no matter how much she questioned it, Brian never explained himself. He simply kept coming back. And then, he made an offer. It was late one evening when Sophie found Brian sitting in the cafe. Long after most of the customers had gone, she approached cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron. You're here late, she noted. He looked up, setting his phone aside. I was waiting for you. Her stomach twisted. Why? Brian leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. I want to offer you a job. Sophie froze. A job? He nodded. Personal chef. For me. She blinked, certain she had misheard him. Excuse me? I want to hire you, Brian said, his tone as smooth as ever. I have an opening in my household. You'd cook for me. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Sophie laughed out loud, unable to help herself. You're joking, right? Not at all, he said, watching her reaction closely. I think you have potential. Sophie folded her arms, shaking her head. You don't even know me. And why would a billionaire hire a cafe barista as his personal chef? Brian smirked. I like taking risks. There it was again. That undeniable pull. That sense that he saw something in her that no one else did. But Sophie was no fool. She knew better than to get tangled up in a world she didn't belong in. She took a step back. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Carter, she said stiffly, but I'm not looking for a job. Brian studied her for a long moment. Then, he smiled. For now, he murmured. And just like that, he left again, leaving Sophie wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Sophie Taylor was no stranger to hardship. Life had never been kind. Never given her the easy road or the lucky break that others seemed to stumble upon effortlessly. Every step forward felt like she had to fight against an invisible force, clawing her way through obstacles that never seemed to end. But she never gave up. Because she couldn't afford to. From the moment she lost her parents, everything changed. She had been barely 18, fresh out of high school, with dreams of college and a future she had carefully mapped out. But life had other plans. A car accident, a single night, and in the blink of an eye, she and her younger brother Oliver were left alone in a world that didn't care about their grief. The next few years were a blur of survival. She worked any job she could find, waitressing, cleaning houses, even working at a laundromat overnight, just to make sure Oliver could stay in school. She gave up on college, on herself, because he came first. And now, at 24, she was still stuck, still fighting, still carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Most days, she didn't let herself think about it, because if she thought about it, she'd break. But on nights like this, when exhaustion clung to her bones and every muscle in her body ached, she couldn't help but wonder, was this all her life would ever be? The night Brian Carter made his ridiculous job offer, Sophie didn't take him seriously. He was a billionaire, and she was, just Sophie. It was a joke, a passing moment of curiosity for a man who probably saw life as a game. She wasn't interested in being part of it. So, she pushed it aside and focused on what really mattered, paying rent, keeping the lights on, and making sure Oliver had enough food on the table. But the universe had a twisted sense of humor. Because that same night, everything fell apart. Sophie had just finished her shift when she got a call from Oliver's school. Her stomach dropped. "Miss Taylor?" The school nurse's voice was calm but too calm, like she was trying not to scare her. "Yes?" Sophie's grip on her phone tightened. "It's Oliver. He collapsed during soccer practice." Her world stopped. Collapsed? Her vision blurred as she ran out of the cafe. Her breath coming too fast. Her heart hammering. "Is he okay?" she gasped. "He's stable, but we need you to come immediately." Sophie didn't remember the drive there. She only remembered running, bursting into the nurse's office and seeing her brother lying on a cot. Pale as a ghost, his breathing shallow. She felt sick. "Oliver." She knelt beside him, pushing his damp hair back. He opened his eyes weakly. "Hey, Soph, what happened?" The nurse sighed. His body temperature spiked. He was sweating, dizzy. He complained of pain in his side before he collapsed. Sophie turned to Oliver, her panic barely contained. "Why didn't you tell me you weren't feeling well?" I didn't want to worry you," he mumbled. Her heart cracked. She touched his face gently. "You're my brother, Oliver. I always want to know when something's wrong." The nurse handed her a form. "He needs tests. We recommend taking him to a hospital as soon as possible." Sophie stared at the paper, her vision swimming. Hospital. Bills. Money she didn't have. She swallowed hard and forced a smile for Oliver. "It's okay. We'll figure it out." But deep down, she didn't know how. That night, after putting Oliver to bed, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she stared at the medical bill. It was more than she made in 2 months. Her chest tightened. She had already maxed out her credit card on groceries and rent. There was no backup plan. She thought about taking a second job, but she was already working 60-hour weeks. When would she sleep? She thought about asking for a loan, but no bank would approve someone with her financial situation. And then, like a ghost, Brian Carter's voice echoed in her mind. "I want to offer you a job." She exhaled sharply. No, she wasn't taking charity. But, was it really charity? He wasn't giving her money, he was offering her work. A job, a paycheck. And right now, she had no choice. Her pride screamed at her to let it go, to find another way. But her brother's health mattered more. So, at midnight, she did the last thing she ever thought she'd do. She texted Brian Carter. "Sophie, is the job offer still open?" Brian didn't take long to respond. 15 minutes later, her phone buzzed. "Brian, meet me at my office tomorrow. 10 a.m. Just like that, like he knew she'd say yes all along. Sophie didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she arrived at the towering Carter Corporation building, feeling wildly out of place in her second-hand dress and scuffed shoes. The receptionist, a woman who looked like she had been carved from stone, raised an eyebrow. "You have an appointment?" "Yes," Sophie said, suddenly doubting everything. With Brian Carter. The receptionist's gaze swept over her like she was dirt under her shoe. "Do you have an invitation?" Sophie inhaled sharply. "I texted him." The woman's lip curled in disdain. "I doubt that." Just as Sophie was about to lose what little patience she had left, a deep voice interrupted. "She's with me." Sophie turned. Brian Carter stood there, hands in his pockets, looking as unfairly perfect as ever. The receptionist immediately straightened. "Mr. Carter, I didn't realize." Brian didn't even glance at her. His gaze was locked on Sophie. "Follow me," he said smoothly. Sophie did, her heart hammering in her chest. Minutes later, she was seated in his office, a glass-walled kingdom that overlooked the entire city. Brian sat across from her, sliding a contract across the desk. "Read it," he said simply. She hesitated before picking it up. "Personal chef. 3 meals a day. 1 week. Payment up front." The amount made her breath hitch. This wasn't a paycheck. This was a lifeline. Brian studied her carefully. "Do we have a deal?" Sophie's hands trembled. She wanted to say no. She wanted to walk away. But then, she thought of Oliver in that hospital bed. And she knew. She had no choice. She picked up the pen and signed away her pride. Sophie Taylor had no idea what she had gotten herself into. She had signed the contract. She had accepted the job. And now she stood in the middle of Brian Carter's penthouse kitchen, staring at the most expensive set of appliances she had ever seen. Feeling like a fraud. This wasn't her world. This wasn't where she belonged. But she had no choice. For Oliver. For her only family. She swallowed her nerves and rolled up her sleeves. Sophie had expected a professional work environment, strict, formal, distant. Instead, Brian Carter was watching her like a hawk. He sat at the kitchen island, a cup of coffee in hand, his gray eyes fixed on her every move. She could feel his gaze like a physical weight, but she refused to look up. She wasn't here to be intimidated. She was here to cook. Sophie inhaled deeply, tying her apron. "You don't have to watch me," she muttered, trying to ignore the way his presence unsettled her. Brian smirked. "I'm curious." "About what?" she asked, cracking eggs into a bowl. He shrugged. "I've hired world-class chefs. You don't seem like one." Sophie's hands froze mid-whisk. A wave of humiliation hit her. She turned slowly, gripping the bowl. "If you have doubts, why did you hire me?" Brian leaned forward, his smirk fading slightly. "Because you intrigue me." Sophie clenched her jaw. She wasn't here to be entertaining. She wasn't here to be an experiment. She was here to earn a paycheck and save her brother's life. "Well, I hope watching me chop vegetables is thrilling for you," she said coldly, turning her back to him. Brian let out a low chuckle but said nothing. For the next hour, Sophie worked in silence, every movement precise, controlled, focused. She chopped, sautéed, plated, and when she placed the finished meal in front of Brian, she crossed her arms and waited for judgment. Brian lifted his fork, took a bite, and then another. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Sophie held her breath. Finally, he set the fork down and met her gaze. "Not bad," he said. She exhaled sharply. "That's it?" Brian's lips twitched. "I don't give compliments easily." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Good, I don't need them." Brian chuckled. Maybe she wasn't as fragile as he thought. The next few days were a test of patience. Brian Carter was infuriating. He had a way of looking at her, not with arrogance, but with curiosity. Like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. It made her uneasy. And it made her angry. "You cook like you have something to prove," Brian remarked one evening as she set down his dinner. Sophie bristled. "Maybe I do." Brian studied her. "To who?" She hesitated. "To herself? To the world that had always told her she wasn't enough? To the parents who left her behind, forcing her to carry a weight she never asked for?" She swallowed. "It doesn't matter," she said, turning away. Brian didn't push, but he watched. And Sophie hated that he saw more than she wanted him to. By the fourth day, Sophie was running on pure exhaustion. Balancing this job, Oliver's hospital visits, and barely sleeping was wearing her down. She tried to hide it. But Brian noticed. He always noticed. "You look like you're about to collapse," he said one evening as she set his plate down. Sophie forced a tired smile. "Thanks. That's exactly what a girl wants to hear." Brian frowned. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Sophie blinked. "I'm working. And I'm your employer. Sit." She hesitated. But her body was so damn tired that she gave in. She sat, resting her arms on the table. Brian pushed his plate toward her. "Eat." Sophie's eyebrows shot up. "What?" "You need to eat." Brian's gaze darkened. "You take care of everyone else. When was the last time someone took care of you?" Sophie froze. Because the answer was never. Her throat tightened. "I'm fine," she lied. Brian shook his head. "You're terrible at lying." Sophie looked away. But the moment broke something inside her. And for the first time in years, she let someone else take care of her. Even if it was just a meal. That night, Sophie checked her phone. A missed call from Oliver's doctor. Her stomach dropped. She called back, her hands shaking. "Sophie." The doctor's voice was gentle but serious. She braced herself. "The test results came in. We need to move forward with Oliver's treatment as soon as possible." Her breath hitched. "How soon?" "Within the next few weeks." Her chest tightened. She didn't have enough money yet. But she would find a way. She always did. Sophie ended the call and took a shaky breath. Then, without thinking, she walked into Brian's office. He looked up from his desk. "Sophie?" She hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I need an advance." Brian set down his pen and studied her carefully. "Why?" Sophie's nails dug into her palms. "I just do." Brian leaned back in his chair. His gaze sharp, calculating. "If this is about your brother." Sophie's heart stopped. She went rigid. Her voice was barely a whisper. "How do you know about Oliver?" Brian sighed. "I looked into your background before hiring you." Sophie's blood ran cold. You, what? Brian exhaled. I needed to know who I was bringing into my home. And now, I know you're working yourself to death for your brother's medical bills. Sophie's knees nearly gave out. Because for the first time in years, someone knew the truth, and that terrified her. Brian stood, walking toward her slowly. I'll pay for everything, he said. Sophie's head snapped up. What? I'll cover all of Oliver's treatment. No strings attached. Sophie took a step back. No, I don't take handouts. Brian smirked. Then consider it a loan. Sophie's heart pounded. A deal with the devil. But her brother's life was on the line. Could she say no? She didn't know. What would you do if you were in Sophie's shoes? Drop a comment below to support her. Subscribe to hear what happens next. Sophie Taylor had never made a deal like this before. She had never asked for help. Never owed anyone anything. And now, Brian Carter had offered her exactly what she needed. Money. Security. A way to save her brother's life. But at what cost? She stood frozen in Brian's luxurious office. Her heart hammering in her chest. His words still echoed in her ears. I'll pay for Oliver's treatment. No strings attached. It should have been a relief. It should have been the answer to her prayers. But instead, it felt like a trap. She clenched her fists. Why? Brian leaned against his desk. His gaze unreadable. Because I can. Sophie shook her head. I don't take charity. Brian tilted his head, studying her. Then don't think of it as charity. He walked toward her slowly. His voice calm. Think of it as a business arrangement. Sophie swallowed. What kind of arrangement? Brian's eyes locked onto hers. You cook for me for 1 more month. Stay here. Take care of the meals. And in return, I'll handle Oliver's hospital bills. Sophie's breath caught. A month. That was all? The answer should have been easy. But something about this deal terrified her. Because she knew Brian Carter was dangerous, not in a criminal way, but in a way that made her heart stumble every time he looked at her. And if she stayed here any longer, she might lose something she had fought so hard to protect. Herself. Sophie exhaled sharply. Her hands shook. She thought about Oliver, his tired eyes, his weak smile, the way he hid his pain so she wouldn't worry. She couldn't let her pride cost him his life. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet Brian's gaze. 1 month. Brian's lips curved slightly. 1 month. Sophie felt something shift between them. An invisible thread tightening. A deal made. A storm brewing. And she had nowhere to run. The days that followed were different. Brian watched her more closely now. Not like before, when he was just curious about the girl who had hugged him by mistake. Now, his gaze was intense, like he was trying to figure her out. And Sophie? She hated that she noticed. One evening, as she served dinner, Brian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You're quieter these days, he said. Sophie didn't look up. I'm working. Brian smirked. Are you afraid of me? Her head snapped up. No. He tilted his head. Then what are you afraid of? Sophie stiffened, because the answer terrified her. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of what he was doing to her. The way he made her feel off balance. Like she wasn't just a girl struggling to survive anymore. Like she was something more. She forced a tight smile. Nothing. Brian didn't believe her. And she knew it. The night Oliver's condition worsened, Sophie felt her world crumble. She had just finished preparing Brian's dinner when her phone rang. The hospital. Her stomach plummeted. She answered, her voice shaky. Hello? The doctor's voice was calm but serious. Sophie, Oliver had another episode. His kidney function is declining faster than we expected. We need to move up the surgery. Her heart stopped. But she wasn't ready. She hadn't saved enough. Sophie, the doctor's voice softened. We don't have time to wait anymore. The call ended, and Sophie felt herself sink to the floor. She covered her mouth to stop the sob that threatened to escape. This was it. If she didn't get the money now, Oliver might not make it. Her vision blurred as panic gripped her chest. Then, a voice. Sophie. She looked up. Brian stood in the doorway. His face hard, unreadable. She wiped her eyes quickly. I have to go. Brian's gaze darkened. What happened? Sophie shook her head. It's Oliver. Her voice broke. He needs surgery. Now. Brian's jaw tightened. Then he did something that made Sophie's world tilt. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke in a voice that sent chills down her spine. Send the payment immediately. Sophie's eyes widened. She stood up fast. Wait, what are you doing? Brian hung up. Then he looked at her with something fierce. Something unwavering. I told you I'd take care of it. Sophie stared at him. Disbelief. Shock. And something else she couldn't name. You barely know me. She whispered. Brian took a step closer. I know enough. Her breath shook. You didn't have to do this. Brian's voice softened. But I wanted to. Sophie's walls cracked. And before she could stop herself, she did something she never thought she would. She hugged him. Again. But this time, it wasn't a mistake. It was gratitude. It was something deeper. Brian stiffened for half a second. Then his arms wrapped around her. Strong. Steady. Like he was holding her together when she was falling apart. Sophie buried her face in his chest. Trying to catch her breath. Trying to understand what was happening. She felt his heartbeat against her cheek. Felt his fingers brush against her back. And for the first time in years, she felt safe. That night, after Oliver's surgery, Sophie sat beside his hospital bed. She held his hand, watching his slow, steady breathing. She had almost lost him. But because of Brian, she didn't. She still didn't understand him. Didn't understand why he cared. Didn't understand what he saw in her. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a deal anymore. It was something else. Something she wasn't ready to name. She glanced at her phone. A single message from Brian. Let me know when Oliver wakes up. Sophie stared at the screen. Then, without thinking, she replied, I will. And deep down, she knew. Her life would never be the same again. Sophie Taylor knew one thing for sure. She couldn't fall for Brian Carter. She couldn't let herself feel anything. Because feelings were dangerous. They made you weak. They made you trust people you had no business trusting. And trust? It had been ripped away from her too many times before. She had barely survived the last time she let herself believe in someone. So why was Brian Carter different? Oliver's surgery had been successful. The doctors were hopeful. He was stable, recovering. But Sophie's heart still felt uneasy. She sat beside Oliver's hospital bed, watching his peaceful face. His breathing was slow, steady. His fingers twitched slightly, as if he were dreaming. She reached out, brushing a hand through his hair. He was everything to her. The reason she had kept fighting. The reason she had worked endless shifts at that cafe. Sacrificing sleep, friendships, and even her own happiness. And the reason she had made a deal with Brian Carter. A man she should have been afraid of. A man who, for some reason, kept showing up. Sophie exhaled sharply and looked at her phone. A single message from him. Let me know when he wakes up. Short, simple, but it made her chest tighten. Because this wasn't just business anymore. This wasn't just some rich man with too much time on his hands. This was Brian Carter, a man who had saved her brother's life. And Sophie had no idea how to repay him. Or why he even cared. The next morning, a knock at the hospital door startled Sophie from her thoughts. She turned, expecting a nurse. But it wasn't. It was him. Brian stood in the doorway, holding a bag of coffee and pastries. As if it was the most normal thing in the world. As if he hadn't just paid thousands of dollars to save Oliver. As if he hadn't completely turned her life upside down. Sophie blinked. What are you doing here? Brian lifted the bag slightly. Bringing breakfast. She frowned. Why? He smirked. Because you look like you haven't eaten in days. Sophie's stomach betrayed her at the worst moment. Growling loudly in the quiet room. Brian's smirk widened. See? I was right. Sophie crossed her arms. I can take care of myself. Brian walked past her and set the bag down anyway. I know. Then, to her absolute horror, he pulled a chair closer and sat down. Like he was planning to stay. Sophie stared. You don't have to be here. Brian shrugged. I know that too. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers to her temples. You have, I don't know, an empire to run? A company? Things that don't involve sitting in a hospital room with me? Brian leaned back in the chair, looking completely unbothered. Turns out, my schedule is flexible. Sophie sighed heavily. You're impossible. Brian just smiled. And Sophie felt something shift inside her. Something dangerous. Something she wasn't ready to face. The hours stretched on. Brian didn't leave. He stayed, talking with Oliver when he woke up. He laughed at his jokes. Even brought a chessboard, teaching him how to play. And every time Oliver smiled, Sophie felt something deep in her chest crack. Because Brian Carter wasn't supposed to be this kind. Wasn't supposed to be this patient. Wasn't supposed to be this real. But here he was. And Sophie didn't know what to do with that. Later that night, after Oliver had fallen asleep again, Sophie walked Brian out of the hospital. The air was cool, crisp. A light breeze swept through the parking lot as they reached his car. Sophie crossed her arms, suddenly uncomfortable. She had been thinking all day, trying to understand why he was still here. Why he hadn't walked away after the money was paid. Why he still cared. She took a deep breath. Why are you doing this? Brian's gray eyes met hers. Unreadable. I told you. Sophie shook her head. You said it was just a deal. But that's over. So why are you still here? For the first time, Brian hesitated, and Sophie saw it. That brief flicker of something he wasn't saying. Then, his voice softened. Because I don't want to leave. Sophie's breath caught. He took a step closer. His expression serious now. I don't do things like this. Sophie. Like what? Like, he exhaled, rubbing a hand through his hair. Like showing up. Like caring. Sophie's heart pounded so hard it hurt. You're acting like this is hard for you. Brian let out a short laugh. But it wasn't amused. It is. Sophie swallowed hard. Why? Brian's gaze was intense now. Because you make me want to be different. The words hit her like a wave. She stared at him, every warning bell in her mind screaming at her to step back. To shut this down. To protect herself. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Brian looked at her like she was something rare. Something he hadn't expected to find. And that terrified her more than anything. Because what if she believed him? What if she let herself hope? And what if, in the end, he left anyway? Just like everyone else had. Sophie took a step back. Brian's expression hardened. A flicker of something, hurt, crossed his face. But it was gone just as quickly. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. I can't do this, Brian. He nodded slowly. I know. He turned to leave, but before he got in his car, he spoke one last time. When you're ready, he said, his voice quiet. You know where to find me. Then he drove off, leaving Sophie standing in the dark. Her hands shaking, her heart a mess of emotions she didn't want to feel. Because Brian Carter was right. She didn't know where to find him. The question was, would she ever let herself? Sophie had spent her whole life fighting. Fighting for survival. Fighting for Oliver. Fighting to keep her heart guarded. But what she didn't expect, what she never prepared for, was fighting herself. Because every time Brian Carter walked into the room, her world tilted just a little. And she didn't know how to handle it. 2 weeks. That's how long it had been since she told Brian she couldn't do this. Since she had walked away from the only man who had ever made her feel safe and terrified at the same time. 2 weeks of silence. No texts. No calls. No unannounced visits with coffee and sarcastic remarks. Brian Carter had listened. And for some reason, that hurt more than anything. Sophie should have been relieved. She had wanted space. Wanted time. But now, with the quiet pressing against her chest like a weight, she wasn't so sure anymore. Sophie was wiping down the cafe counter, lost in thought, when the door swung open. She looked up, expecting a customer. But instead, she froze. Because it was him. Brian. Standing in the doorway like a ghost from a past she hadn't even fully left behind. Her heart stumbled. He looked different. A little tired. A little more guarded. Like someone who had finally accepted that he had lost a battle he never wanted to fight in the first place. Their eyes met. And in that moment, everything she had been avoiding hit her all at once. Brian cleared his throat. Hey. Sophie gripped the counter. Hey. A beat of silence. Then, finally. You look. Brian hesitated, studying her. Tired. Sophie almost laughed. You always know just what to say. Don't you? His lips twitched. Guess I'm out of practice. She swallowed. Yeah, it's been a while. Another silence. This one heavier. Brian exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I wasn't sure if I should come. Sophie hesitated. Why did you? His gray eyes held hers. Searching. Because I can't seem to stay away from you. Her breath caught. Because even though she had told herself she needed space, even though she had convinced herself she was doing the right thing, she missed him. God, she missed him. But she couldn't say that. So instead, she did what she always did. She deflected. Want some coffee? She asked, reaching for a cup. Brian let out a quiet laugh. Are we pretending everything's normal? Maybe. Alright, he leaned against the counter. Let's pretend. Then, she poured the coffee, her hands steadier than they should have been. And when she slid it across the counter, their fingers brushed, just for a second. A second too long. A second too much. Brian noticed. And Sophie felt everything unraveling. Sophie had told herself she would move on. That if she ignored the ache in her chest long enough, it would just disappear. But standing there, watching Brian sip his coffee like nothing had changed, she realized she had been lying to herself. Because nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. Brian set the cup down and tilted his head slightly. You're thinking too hard. She blinked. What? You do that thing where you frown just a little when you're overthinking. Sophie exhaled sharply. Maybe I'm just trying to figure you out. Brian smirked. Good luck with that. She shook her head, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like they were back to where they used to be. Before the hesitation, before the walls, before everything got too complicated. But then, the moment shattered, because Brian set his coffee down and got serious. I'm leaving, Sophie. Her stomach dropped. What? Brian leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. I had to go to London for a while. Business stuff. Sophie's fingers curled around the edge of the counter. For how long? A few months, maybe more. Her throat closed up. So, this is goodbye? Brian's jaw tensed. I don't want it to be. And suddenly, she couldn't breathe. Because if he left, if he really walked away, what did that mean for them? What did that mean for her? Sophie. Her name. Soft. Like a question. Like a plea. She shook her head. You're serious? Brian nodded. I can't stay here waiting for you to be ready. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it, something raw. I don't know how to stop wanting you, Sophie, but I do know I can't keep standing still. Her heart pounded, because this wasn't just about London. It was about them, about the line they had been dancing around for too long. And now, it was time to choose a side. Sophie wanted to say something. Anything. But the words got stuck. Brian exhaled, his fingers tapping against the counter. Tell me to stay. She froze. What? Tell me to stay. Sophie. His voice was steady, but his eyes weren't. Give me a reason. She felt the weight of it. The weight of everything left unsaid. If she told him to stay, then it meant admitting what she had been running from all along. It meant admitting she felt something real. But if she let him go, then maybe she didn't deserve him at all. Her lips parted. She almost said it. Almost. But in the end, she just couldn't. And that silence, that awful, heavy silence, was her answer. Brian's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Got it, Brian. He shook his head, stepping back. No, it's okay. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I won't ask again. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. And Sophie let him, even though it broke her in ways she didn't know how to fix. The days stretched on without him. And Sophie felt every single one of them. She tried to pretend it didn't matter. Tried to move on. But every time she walked past his empty table at the cafe. Every time she reached for her phone only to remember he wouldn't text. Every time she closed her eyes at night and felt the hollow ache of missing him. She knew the truth. She had made a mistake. A mistake she wasn't sure she could ever fix. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if she'd ever get the chance. Regret. It was a cruel, unrelenting thing. It sat in Sophie's chest like a stone, pressing down with each passing day. Brian was gone. Not just gone, he had walked away because she let him. And now, the world felt just a little quieter. A little colder. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into a month. And still, she felt him everywhere. She saw him in the empty chair at the cafe. Felt him in the way the city lights flickered at night. Like the way his eyes used to when he laughed. He was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sophie had spent her whole life telling herself that she didn't need anyone. That love was a luxury she couldn't afford to believe in. But now she understood something she had never wanted to admit. She did need someone. She needed him. And the realization? It came too late. Sophie had tried to reach out, once. The night before Brian's flight to London. She had sat at her tiny kitchen table, pen in hand, heart in pieces, and written the words she couldn't say out loud. Brian, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to love someone without being afraid of losing them. But I miss you. And I wish I had told you to stay. Because maybe then, I wouldn't feel like I was losing a part of myself. Maybe then, I wouldn't feel like an idiot for letting you go. Sophie. She had folded the letter. Sealed it. Held onto it like a lifeline. And then, she had never sent it. Because what if it was too late? What if he had already moved on? The fear of knowing had been worse than the regret itself. One evening, Sophie was closing up the cafe when Oliver found her sitting in the back room. Staring at the clock, she had no idea how long she had been lost in thought. But the quiet concern in her brother's voice made her blink back to reality. "You okay?" he asked. Leaning against the doorframe, Sophie let out a humorless laugh. "I don't know." Oliver studied her, arms crossed. "Is this about Brian?" Her chest tightened. "What makes you think that?" He scoffed. "Because for the past month, you've been pretending you're fine while looking like someone stole the last piece of your favorite puzzle." Sophie sighed, rubbing her temples. "I let him go, Ollie. That was my choice." "Yeah? And how's that working out for you?" She shot him a glare. Oliver didn't back down. "Look, Soph, I don't know much about love," he said, voice softer now, "but I do know you. And I know that whatever happened between you and Brian, it wasn't supposed to end like this." Sophie's throat tightened. "You don't understand. Then make me understand." She exhaled, her hands trembling as she finally said the truth she had been avoiding. "I was scared." Oliver waited. Sophie swallowed hard, eyes glassy. "I was scared that if I let myself love him, it would ruin me. That if I let him in, he'd leave someday, and I wouldn't survive it." Oliver's expression softened. "And now?" She let out a broken laugh. "And now, I realize I ruined myself anyway." Her voice cracked. "Because I let him go." Oliver was quiet for a moment before stepping forward and placing something on the table in front of her. Sophie frowned. It was a plane ticket. Her heart stopped. "Oliver." He crossed his arms, smirking. "London's not that far. Soph." Sophie stared at the ticket. Heart pounding. Could she? Should she? Because if she went, if she showed up at his doorstep, it would mean admitting everything. It would mean no more running. No more pretending. And that thought terrified her. But not as much as the thought of never seeing Brian again. The plane ride felt like a dream. Or a mistake. Or both. Sophie didn't know what she was expecting when she landed in London. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't leaving without seeing him. She spent the entire cab ride rehearsing what she'd say. She went over 100 different ways this could go wrong. And yet, her feet still carried her to his door. Her knuckles still knocked. And when the door swung open, she forgot how to breathe. Because there he was. Brian Carter. Standing in the doorway, eyes wide, completely stunned. "Sophie?" Her chest ached at the way he said her name. Like a question. Like a hope he had given up on. She licked her lips, suddenly unable to remember a single word of the speech she had prepared. Her voice failed her. Brian's brows furrowed. "You're here." Sophie exhaled shakily. "Yeah." A beat of silence. Then, "Why?" Sophie's throat tightened. "Because this was it. Her last chance. I made a mistake." Brian stilled. "I should have told you to stay," she whispered, eyes burning. "I should have let myself love you. Because I do. Brian, I love you. And I'm so." Her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry." Brian's expression was unreadable. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stood there, staring at her. Then, he let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Say it again." Sophie blinked. "What?" Brian stepped closer, his voice softer now. "Say it again." Her heart pounded. She swallowed hard, voice barely above a whisper. "I love you." Brian's lips curved into the smallest, most broken smile she had ever seen. And then, his arms were around her, holding her so tightly she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. Sophie closed her eyes, pressing her face into his chest, breathing him in. "I love you too," Brian murmured, his voice hoarse. And just like that, she wasn't lost anymore. She was home. Sophie had always believed that love was fragile, that it could be broken with a single mistake. That once shattered, it could never be put back together. But as she sat across from Brian Carter, holding his hand in the dim light of a quiet London cafe, she realized something. Love wasn't fragile at all. It was resilient. It was stubborn. And sometimes, it just needed to be fought for. After that night, the night she finally told Brian she loved him, Sophie had expected things to fall into place immediately. She had expected a fairy tale ending, a happily ever after. But love wasn't that simple. Because even though Brian had held her, even though he had whispered that he loved her too, she had seen the hesitation in his eyes, the fear, the uncertainty, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't the only one who was afraid. Brian had been hurt too. She had left him once. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't sure if she would leave again. That thought broke her, because he deserved better than that. Brian, Sophie said softly, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly as she gathered the courage to say what needed to be said. He looked up from across the table, those familiar gray eyes filled with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite decipher. "What is it?" he asked. Sophie took a breath. "I need you to know something," she said, voice steady but heart-pounding. Brian set his cup down, watching her closely. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. A flicker of emotion passed across his face, so fast she almost missed it. But she didn't miss the way his hands tightened slightly around his coffee cup. "Sophie." She shook her head. "No, let me say this." Brian exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I was scared," she admitted, terrified, actually, of how much I cared about you, of how much you meant to me. Because I thought if I let myself love you, I'd lose myself in it." Brian was silent. Sophie swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep going. "But the truth is, Brian, I was already lost without you." His jaw clenched, but he still didn't speak. Sophie felt her chest tighten. "Do you believe me?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Brian looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, "I want to," he admitted, "but I don't know how." Sophie felt her heart ache. Because she understood. She had been the one to run. She had been the one to leave him standing there, alone. And now, she had to prove to him that she was done running. Brian didn't ask her to stay in London. He didn't ask for anything. Which was how Sophie knew she had to make the decision on her own. So, when she packed up her tiny apartment back home, when she said goodbye to Oliver and the cafe, when she boarded that plane back to London, she did it because she chose him. Not because he asked, not because he begged, but because she wanted to. And when she showed up at his door a week later, bags in hand, heart in her throat, she saw it. The exact moment Brian Carter let himself believe. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about love ever was. There were still nights when Brian would pull away just a little. Moments when Sophie caught him watching her, as if waiting for the moment she would disappear. But she didn't. She stayed. She reminded him, every single day, that she wasn't going anywhere. And slowly, he started to believe it. It had been months since Sophie had moved to London. Months of learning how to be with Brian without letting fear ruin it. Months of watching him slowly let his walls down. And then, one day, he did something that nearly shattered her heart all over again. "Sophie," he said one evening, standing in the kitchen as she cooked dinner. She glanced over her shoulder, smiling. "Yeah?" Brian hesitated, and that was the first sign that something was wrong. "I need to go away for a little while," he said finally. Sophie's heart dropped. Her hands stilled over the stove. "What?" Brian took a breath. "A business trip. 2 months. Maybe longer." The air felt heavier suddenly. Sophie knew she had no right to stop him. But it felt like history repeating itself. Like the past was creeping back in, threatening to rip them apart all over again. "Come with me," Brian said suddenly, as if he could read her mind. Sophie's chest tightened. "You want me to go with you?" "Of course, I do." But, she hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip. "What if I can't? What if I have to stay here?" Brian stepped closer, cupping her face with both hands. "Then I'll wait for you," he said simply. Tears burned her eyes. "Really?" Brian let out a small, soft laugh. "Sophie, I love you. I don't care where we are. As long as I know you're coming back to me." And just like that, the fear was gone. Because for the first time, Sophie realized, love wasn't about running or chasing. It was about trusting. And she trusted him. Completely. The airport felt different this time. No more rushed mistakes. No more misunderstandings. Sophie hugged Brian tightly, not out of desperation, but out of certainty. "I'll be back before you know it," she whispered. Brian smiled. brushing a soft kiss against her forehead. I know. Because now, there were no doubts left between them. Comment below and let me know, would you fight for love like Sophie did? Subscribe for more emotional love stories that prove second chances are real. Sophie had thought she was done with goodbyes. That she had fought the battle of fear and love. That she had won. But as she stood alone in their quiet apartment, staring at the empty space where Brian's luggage had been just hours ago, she realized the real fight was only just beginning. It had been 2 weeks since Brian left for his business trip, and every single day felt heavier than the last. At first, she had convinced herself it would be easy. That she would wake up, go to work, run the cafe, visit Oliver, fill her days with enough distractions to make time pass quickly. But nothing could prepare her for the ache of coming home to silence. Of walking into a space that felt colder without him. The nights were the worst. She would turn in bed, instinctively reaching for him, only to be met with empty sheets. And in those moments, she realized something she had never admitted before. Brian Carter had become home. Not London, not the apartment, him. And now, she felt utterly lost without him. She had been lonely before. She had spent years building walls around herself, convincing herself she didn't need anyone. But this was different. Because now, she knew what it felt like to be loved. She knew what it felt like to be held after a bad day. To wake up to someone's arms around her. To share her laughter and her silence. And now that she had tasted that kind of love, going back to being alone felt like suffocating. Her phone was always in her hand. Brian had texted her every night. Good morning, beautiful. How was your day? I miss you. She would type out responses, then delete them, because how could she tell him the truth? How could she admit, without sounding weak, that she felt like she was falling apart without him? So instead, she sent simple replies. I miss you too. Work was fine. Can't wait for you to come back. And every time she sent a message, she felt like she was lying. Because fine wasn't the right word. She wasn't fine. She was breaking. One night, when the weight of missing him felt unbearable, her phone rang. Brian. She answered immediately, pressing the phone against her ear like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. Hey, she breathed. Hey. Brian's voice was warm, but tired. I'm sorry I didn't call earlier. Meetings ran late. She squeezed her eyes shut. She wanted to say, I don't care about the meetings. I just need to hear your voice. But instead, she said, it's okay. There was silence on the other end. And then, you don't sound okay, Brian said, his voice soft but knowing. Sophie swallowed. She couldn't lie. Not to him. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. There was another pause. Then, me neither, Brian said. Sophie's heart clenched, because she had thought he was doing fine. That he was busy and distracted by work. But now, hearing the exhaustion in his voice, she realized, he was struggling too. I miss you, he admitted. Sophie closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears threatening to fall. I miss you too. I didn't think it would be this hard, he confessed. I thought I could focus on work and make the time go by faster. But, it's not working. Sophie let out a shaky breath. Brian, yeah? She hesitated. Then, for the first time, she let herself be honest. I don't feel like myself without you. Brian exhaled sharply on the other end. And for a moment, she worried that maybe she had said too much. That maybe she had made herself too vulnerable. But then, Sophie, he murmured, I know exactly what you mean. She wiped at her eyes, biting her lip to keep her emotions in check. How are we supposed to do this? She whispered. Brian was quiet for a long moment. Then, we just hold on. Sophie swallowed hard. Hold on? To us. She felt those words settle deep into her soul. And in that moment, she realized, she wasn't alone in this. Brian was feeling every ache, every sleepless night, every moment of longing too. And that meant they would get through it. Together. A week later, Sophie was closing up the cafe when her phone rang again. Brian. She smiled, already feeling lighter just seeing his name. Hey, you're early tonight, she teased, balancing the phone between her shoulder and cheek as she wiped down the counter. Yeah, he said, his voice holding a strange excitement. She paused. What's going on? I have a surprise for you. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Brian, if this is another package of ridiculously expensive coffee beans. I swear. It's not coffee. Sophie. She could hear the smile in his voice. Then what is it? Turn around. Sophie froze. Her heart stopped. Slowly, she turned, and there he was. Brian Carter, standing in the doorway of the cafe. Dressed in a suit, his gray eyes locked onto hers with so much love it nearly took her breath away. Her phone slipped from her fingers, crashing onto the floor. She didn't care. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms. And the moment he caught her, holding her tight against his chest, she knew. This was home. Not a place. Not an apartment. Him. You're back. She breathed against his shoulder, tears slipping down her face. Brian tightened his hold on her. I couldn't stay away any longer. She pulled back just enough to look at him, searching his face. What about your meetings? I don't care. Her heart swelled. You really came back early, just for me? Brian let out a soft laugh, brushing his fingers through her hair. Sophie, he said, tilting her chin up, I'd come back for you every single time. And when he kissed her, slow and deep, pouring every missed moment, every unspoken word into it, she realized she would never doubt this love again. Because some people were worth waiting for, and some loves were worth holding on to forever. Sophie stood at the edge of the world she had once been afraid to step into. The wedding dress clung to her like a second skin, elegant yet simple, just like she had always wanted. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the reflection staring back at her in the mirror. A woman who had survived. A woman who had loved. A woman who was no longer afraid. If someone had told her a year ago that she would be marrying a billionaire, she would have laughed in their face. Her life had been a quiet, careful existence, built on routine and responsibility. She had never had the luxury of dreaming about happily ever afters. But Brian Carter had changed all of that. He had walked into her world by accident, by a mistake, a ridiculous, embarrassing wrong hug at an airport. And yet, somehow, that one moment had rewritten both of their destinies. Now, as she stood waiting to walk down the aisle, she realized every tear, every fear, every moment of doubt had led her here, to him. The venue was breathtaking. Golden sunlight spilled through the towering glass windows, illuminating the floral arrangements that lined the aisle. Sophie took a deep breath as she clutched her bouquet, her fingers trembling slightly. Then, the music started, the doors opened, and there he was. Brian Carter. Her love, her home, her future. He stood at the altar, dressed in a tailored black suit, his silver gray eyes locked onto hers with a depth that made her knees weak. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the whispers of the crowd. Not the cameras capturing every second. Not even the past that had once held her back. All that mattered was him. With each step, the fear melted away, because this wasn't just a wedding. This was a promise. When she reached him, Brian took her hands gently, his thumb brushing over her skin as if to remind her he was real. This was real. The officiant smiled and nodded for them to begin. Brian cleared his throat, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Sophie, he began, his voice thick with emotion. The first time I met you, you didn't even realize who I was. You didn't care about my last name, my wealth, or my reputation. All you saw was a stranger who smelled good and had really bad luck at avoiding unexpected hugs. The crowd chuckled, but Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. You treated me like a normal person. Brian continued. You challenged me. You made me want to be a better man. His voice softened. I never thought I'd find someone who loved me for who I am. Not what I have. But you never once made me feel like I had to prove myself. You loved me when I was lost. And you saved me in ways you don't even realize. Sophie felt a tear slip down her cheek. Brian squeezed her hands and smiled. And now, standing here, I can promise you this. I will spend every single day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me. The guests sighed in admiration. But Sophie barely heard them. Because Brian Carter, the man who had once been unreachable, was standing in front of her, giving her his heart. She took a shaky breath, gathering herself before she spoke. Brian, she began, her voice trembling with emotion. The first time I met you, I was running from my own past, my own fears, my own belief that love was something that could never be meant for me. She felt his fingers tighten around hers. But then you showed up, and you refused to let me hide. You saw me when I didn't want to be seen. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." A tear slipped down Brian's cheek, and Sophie reached up, gently wiping it away. "And now, I promise you, I will never run again. Not from you. Not from love. Not from our future." She smiled, her heart full. Because home isn't a place. It's you. And when Brian leaned in, kissing her with all the love he had, she knew this was forever. That night, as they danced under the twinkling fairy lights, Sophie thought about how far they had come. There had been so many moments when she had almost walked away. So many moments when her fear had nearly ruined everything. But love, real love, didn't let go so easily. And that's what this story had been about all along. Not money, not status, not fairy tale endings, but about choosing love, even when it's terrifying. About believing in second chances, even when the past tells you you don't deserve them. Life is unpredictable. Sophie never planned to fall in love with a billionaire. She never imagined her life would change with one accidental hug. But fate has a funny way of bringing the right people into our lives at the right time. Fear should never stop you from love. Sophie almost lost Brian because she was afraid of getting hurt. But love isn't about being safe, it's about taking the risk anyway. Real love isn't about money or status, it's about connection. Brian had everything in the world, but none of it mattered without Sophie. At the end of the day, we all want the same thing. Someone who sees us, truly sees us, and loves us anyway. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been afraid to love? How did you overcome it? Rate this love story from 1 to 10. Was this the ending you were hoping for? Hit the like button if you believe in second chances and true love. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful love stories that remind us, sometimes, the best things in life happen when we least expect them. And remember, love isn't about who you are or what you have. It's about who's willing to stand by your side. Through everything. Forever.